it's an awful saying, but the pilot is always the first person to arrive at the scene of a crash.
Nobody to land at the airport. We've had a crash.
It was a typical summer evening at Dallas/Fort Worth International Airport in 1985. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sprawling runways. Inside Terminal C, passengers moved lazily between gates, their movements punctuated by the occasional announcement over the PAW system. It was another busy day for Delta Airlines, but nothing about it felt extraordinary. Flight 191, a regularly scheduled service from Dallas to Fort Lauderdale, had been delayed for over an hour due to what was, at the time, an unremarkable delay. Passengers shuffled into their seats on board the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, a reliable wide-bodied aircraft known for its comfort and stability. The crew, led by Captain Alfred E. L. Haynes, had been flying together for several years. Haynes was an experienced and calm captain, well respected by his colleagues. The rest of the crew included First Officer Joseph R. Joe L. Timmons and Flight Engineer Dennis L. Hines. They had prepared meticulously for the flight, running through their pre-flight checks with precision. But what no one on board could have known was that, just as the plane began taxiing to the runway, a storm system was quietly brewing in the distance. By the time Flight 191 had taken off, the storm had shifted from a benign weather system to something far more sinister. Meteorologists had been tracking the development of a squall line, a band of severe thunderstorms that stretched from east to west, centered over the area where Flight 191 was heading. Though the storm's intensity was not immediately apparent, it was gaining strength rapidly. These types of storms could develop quickly, and once they did, they had the potential to cause deadly turbulence, severe wind shear, and even lightning strikes. The cockpit crew was briefed on the weather and updated as the flight progressed. The passengers, for their part, remained mostly unaware of the danger until the aircraft reached cruising altitude. The early portion of the flight was uneventful. The flight attendants served drinks, passengers flipped through magazines, and children stared out the windows as the patchwork of Texas farmland stretched beneath them. At 6:07 p.m., about 60 miles east of Dallas, Captain Haynes received a weather update indicating a rapidly intensifying thunderstorm ahead. The message warned of possible wind shear, a potentially deadly phenomenon in which wind changes speed and direction sharply over short distances. Such sudden shifts could throw an aircraft off course, or worse, cause it to lose altitude or control. "Keep an eye on this one," Captain Haynes said, his voice steady, to First Officer Timmons. He knew the terrain. The flight would soon pass through the narrow corridor between the storm's outer edge and the airport's airspace. The area was notoriously difficult to navigate because of the irregular winds patterns caused by the storm. Haynes tightened his grip on the controls, already anticipating what was coming. As Flight 191 approached the storm, the first signs of trouble appeared. The air grew thick with humidity, and the aircraft began to feel the effects of turbulence. The ride, though bumpy, wasn't yet dangerous, and the passengers, although nervous, were still relatively comfortable. Flight attendants secured the cabin and took their seats, their faces revealing a subtle tension that didn't escape the observant eye. At around 6:17 p.m., just as the plane was nearing the storm's outer edge, a sudden and violent downdraft slammed into the aircraft. Wind shear had struck with brutal force. Within moments, the plane plummeted, its altitude dropping by more than 1,000 feet in just a few seconds. Flight Engineer Dennis Hines, who had been monitoring the systems, called out to the cockpit. "We've lost power on engines 2 and 3, he reported urgently. Engine 2, the left side engine, was sputtering. The other engine, the right side engine, had completely failed. "What happened?" Captain Haynes asked, his voice firm but tinged with concern. He had been through turbulence before, but nothing quite like this. The aircraft was no longer responding to the controls in a way the crew was accustomed to. The aircraft was now dangerously low, approaching the ground at an alarming rate. The instruments on the control panel showed discrepancies. An altimeter that should have been ticking down in a smooth, predictable way was jumping erratically. The autopilot, which had been engaged moments before the storm hit, was not able to compensate for the sudden loss of control. "We've got to get this under control," Captain Haynes muttered, his eyes scanning the instruments rapidly. But with two engines out and the storm surging violently around them, the chance of regaining control of the aircraft seemed slim. In the cabin, the passengers were beginning to realize the severity of the situation. The plane bucked and jolted violently, shaking every few seconds as the crew fought to maintain control. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments. The once calm flight attendants now had a look of visible worry. This wasn't just turbulence anymore. It was something much worse. Captain Haynes' instincts kicked in. He ordered the crew to begin an emergency descent. The aircraft was already dangerously close to the ground, and a controlled crash landing seemed like the only chance for survival. But in those terrifying moments, he also had to rely on something even more fundamental: his experience. First Officer Timmons communicated with air traffic control, reporting the situation in a calm but urgent tone. "We've had an engine failure. We need vectors for an emergency landing." He requested a heading that would bring them toward an emergency landing strip, ideally before the storm could worsen. But nature had other plans. The storm was now directly over them, and the visibility was almost zero. The aircraft was disoriented. Captain Haynes knew they were flying blind, their instruments now almost useless due to the severe wind shear and turbulence. Minutes seemed like hours as the plane plummeted closer to the earth. The ground below was a blur, nothing but dark shapes and flashes of light from the lightning that erupted from the storm. At 6:19 p.m., Flight 191 lost communication with air traffic control. The storm had disrupted all radio transmissions. For a moment, Captain Haynes felt utterly alone, the weight of the moment settling in. The storm was at its most violent when the plane finally descended beneath the cloud cover. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the ground was still invisible. Through the haze of panic and fear, Captain Haynes saw the faint outline of a runway ahead, just as the aircraft continued to sink lower. It was an airstrip that had been built for emergencies, but it was not a full commercial runway. It was short, unpaved, and surrounded by trees. The odds of landing there were incredibly slim. As the aircraft approached the ground, the plane's remaining engine roared with a defiant hum, pushing them ever closer to the earth. But even with all the skill in the world, Haynes knew the situation was dire. The plane was too fast, too low, and the storm too violent to allow for a safe landing. They had mere seconds to make a decision. "Brace for impact," Captain Haynes shouted over the intercom. The plane hit the ground with a sickening thud, its wheels scraping across the wet, uneven ground. The tires exploded in the impact, sending shards of rubber flying through the air. The plane skidded across the grass, its belly dragging through the mud. The sound of the engines whirring violently was drowned out by the screams of passengers, the shriek of metal on earth. Then suddenly, the noise stopped. When the storm finally passed, the surviving passengers of Flight 191 found themselves in an eerie silence. The plane had come to a halt, resting just yards away from a cluster of trees. The night was thick with humidity, and the air smelled of gasoline and rain. But they were alive. Miraculously, only 137 people had been aboard, and 82 of them survived. The first responders arrived within minutes, their vehicles streaking through the muddy field. Many of the survivors were disoriented but unharmed. Some were injured, but none of the wounds were life-threatening. In the end, the crew's quick thinking, combined with a miraculous stroke of luck, had saved countless lives. Captain Haynes and his crew were hailed as heroes, their actions that day a testament to their training, resilience, and ability to make life-or-death decisions in a moment of unimaginable pressure. But in the weeks and months following the crash, investigations revealed something chilling. The storm had created a perfect storm of conditions, including extreme wind shear, that made any chance of survival seem unlikely. The survivors carried their scars, both physical and emotional, with them. But Flight 191 was also a story of redemption and the will to survive. In the aftermath, the aviation world would learn valuable lessons from the crash, lessons that would eventually lead to new standards for storm forecasting, weather radar technology, and cockpit procedures. Delta Airlines Flight 191, while a tragedy in many ways, had also changed the course of aviation safety forever. The storm, that deadly, ferocious storm, would become a symbol of the unpredictable power of nature, but also a reminder of the strength of human spirit in the face of the most terrifying challenges.